Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I'm delighted to host Professor Catherine Powell-WARREN, who is an assistant professor at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and she's joining us from there. Her work focuses on the role of early modern women in the creation, production, and patronage of art in the Low Countries, with a specific emphasis on the power of networks and community. And today she's going to share parts of her most recent research project that concluded in October. Professor Powell-WARREN, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's very late over there. So
thank you so much for having me.
Of course, a pleasure for us, a pleasure. So you should be able to share your screen right now.
Okay, let's see. Predictably. And okay, how's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Practice makes it perfect.
It does. Thank you so much again for having me. It's really a privilege to be speaking to everybody about this project, which, as you mentioned, is just wrapped up at the end of September. And these are some of the early results, basically, that I have. And the project in question is called Project HiveMind, the full title of which is Networks, Collectivity, and Mentorship Amongst Women Artists, Patrons, and Collectors in the Low Country. And this project came about basically as I was researching early modern women artists, and so many of them came with the caveat that no work survived, or that so very little documentation survived about these women artists. And so the project set out to take a community and institution-based approach to the study of these early modern women. The point of departure for the project is the group of women proximate to the still life painter Rachel Rausch, and that group included her sister Anna, as well as Maria Moninckx, Maria Sibylla Merian, Johanna Helena Herolt, Dorothea Maria Graf, Alida Withoos, and Cornelia de Rijk. Now, there's no written evidence that these women ever met, but they all did one thing, which is they painted flowers and nature and insects. So given the lack of evidence that the women may never have met, the project proceeded by exploring relationships amongst the women and their roles in the networks that they occupied. And so the objective of the project was really to uncover the various ways in which the various ways, if and whether the women influenced each other, helped each other develop technically, shared resources, competed with each other, and even positioned each other with patrons. And we are now, the development of early modern botanical science in the Dutch Republic certainly was shaped by relationships. The formulation of processes of inquiry and the creation and dissemination of knowledge were really made possible through collaboration amongst like-minded individuals. Now, given the importance of relationships, in addition to asking who the artist is and what they made, I also asked questions such as whom did the artist know and who knew of her? Who might have given access to the subject matter of the work, and whether or not there may have been someone else who taught the artist how to, for example, execute the perfect shine on a beetle's carapace. And finding links has meant not only considering personal connections, but also inanimate ones. And here are some of the tables from the currently very messy database that I assembled, which basically set out the core artists, the female artists, together with the contemporaries, their mentors, many of whom were men, and then against that, trying to track down the flowers and insects that they painted. And so the argument being, or hypothesis, was that by isolating rare or uncommon flowers or insect species in their illustrations and paintings, that this might reveal connections that are not otherwise immediately obvious. And this also, of course, provides information regarding the artistic process of the women artists about whom we know so little. And one of the findings that I made, for example, was that the artists in the group of women that I studied did begin in part to show a very accentuated S-curve, which was uncommon in botanical illustrations. Similarly, some of them began illustrating certain types of flowers, for example, this poisonous datura, which was not otherwise found so readily in the works of their contemporaries. For today, however, so these arguments I've made elsewhere, and for today, however, the idea is to focus on what makes a community. So the women were part of a broader network that permitted the illustration of botanical science, and as such, they did participate in a very large enterprise, if we want to call it that. But in addition, the question is, did these women find community with each other? Community of a sense, in the sense that has been, for example, defined by community psychologists David Macmillan and David Chavis. And they, I believe, offer helpful guidance. So they use the 4 pillars of membership in the sense of personal investment in the group, influence or a sense of mattering to the community, integration or the fulfillment of needs, and a shared emotional connection. And tonight, for the purposes of the discussion, this is the cast of characters on which I will focus and examine the components of their stories, how they came to know each other, the type of work that they did, and little hints that can be found either in the works themselves or in the broader context in which they operated that can tell us that indeed they did find something akin to a female community in early modernity. So the artists about whom you'll hear a lot tonight are Maria Sibylla Merian and her daughter, Johanna Helena Herolt, Alida Withoos, and Maria Moninckx. There will be the patron who's sort of at the core of this community named Agnes Block. There are 2 collections that will feature prominently. One, of course, is a collection of watercolors that was owned by Block, her Florilegia. And the other one is called the Moninckx Atlas, which was a 9-volume series of really prestigious watercolors that were commissioned by the Amsterdam Botanical Garden, or Hortus Medicus, to which we will return during the talk. Also featuring large are the garden circuit, or rather the people who were members of this garden circuit. The term garden circuit comes from a wonderful scholar, Dio Wijnands, who made archival research at the Amsterdam Hortus Botanicus and really made so many terrific findings. And he coined the term to refer to a group of individuals in and around Amsterdam, scarcely more than, say, 15 of them, who were collectors and botanical experts and academics, and they were merchants, and they were people who traded in species and in information and knowledge. So garden circuit as an entity will be a relevant character. And finally, there are really 2 places. The locus of the sort of play for tonight will be the country estate that belonged to Block, which is known as Vijverhof, which means pond court, basically. And the other one is the Amsterdam Hortus Botanicus. Now, a little bit of context for those who are not so familiar with the development of natural history in the Dutch Republic, or indeed in Northern Europe. Now, until the 17th century, the development of science really took place in the domestic setting. Gardens and kitchens were essentially experimental laboratories where collectors and midwives and gardeners and apothecaries and others with a mind for discovery and experimentation gathered and created and shared knowledge. And the presence of women in this environment would not have surprised any of the participants, given the traditional associations between women and healing and gardens and remedies. Now, by the 17th century, there was a shift that took place. So, for example, this is an engraving of the botanical garden or the academic garden at Leiden University, which is outside of Amsterdam, but also in the Netherlands. And it was the first one to be founded in the Dutch Republic. Now, this engraving from 1601 shows clusters of individuals. And these individuals are men, and they're discussing plants and learning. Now, women could visit the garden, but only outside of these hours of instruction. And by the second half of the 17th century, there was the foundation of the Royal Society in London in 1660, to which many members of this Amsterdam garden circuit belonged. And there was also the foundation of l'Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris in 1666. And with that, the institutionalization of science was really entrenched. And the consequences for women were really twofold. Was that they lost the control, if you will, over these experiments and over this direction that science could take. And they were really pushed to the margins. So they could seldom participate directly in the formal structures, such as professional societies or universities, where knowledge was produced and disseminated. And moreover, as the professionalization of science moved along, more and more Latin became the lingua franca, and since many women, most women, did not possess Latin because they had not attended Latin schools, this created a further exclusion. So against this background, the achievements of the women that we consider today are even more remarkable. The first character in the play is really the anchor of this story, who's Agnes Block. She's been really mostly forgotten except in specialized circles until recently, but she's emerged as a consequential figure of the second half of the 17th century in the Dutch Republic. She was a self-taught horticulturist and botanist, a country estate owner and designer. She was a collector of art and naturalia. She was a patron, and she really defied the stereotypes of early modern women that perhaps you have seen in the paintings of Vermeer or Gabriel Metsu. She was orphaned at an early age, and she grew up with her maternal aunt and uncle, who were wealthy and afforded her a humanist education in which she learned to read and write with a focus, of course, on religious texts, but also was introduced to creative pursuits such as music, drawing, and embroidering. The Dutch poet who's really celebrated, Jos van den Vondel, was a member of her extended family, and he became her uncle through marriage, and he wrote that she was an avid reader. Block married twice, which was not uncommon for the time, both times to prominent merchants in the Mennonite community to which she belonged. Now, unlike many women of her time, she did not bear any children of her own, but she was a stepmother to a young son from her first marriage and to two adult daughters from her second marriage. The defining feature of Block's life was really her country estate of Beverhof, which is located along the river between Amsterdam and Utrecht. And this is the estate that is portrayed here in the background of this portrait by Jan Moninckx. Here we go. Block, of course, is at the center, which really tells you the kind of unique individual she was in this composition, if you will, whereas usually the husband would be on the left-hand side and or heraldic right, and then the women on the other side. Here, it is Block who is at the center of the composition, and her husband, if you will, acts as a pendant. The children are probably grandchildren, and they are shown outside. Now, this estate was entirely Block's creation, and it always remained hers. She acquired it in 1670, shortly after the death of her first husband, and she invested years of labor and substantial amounts of capital to turn it into a genuine estate. So whereas there had only been a farmstead before, she created an estate with a large house, and it also had flower and kitchen gardens, an orchard, hedgerows, parterres, ponds, and aviary. Now, her reputation was built upon her success tending to the rare and non-native flowers and trees in her greenhouses and orangery. And there, using mostly seeds and bulbs, she devised ways to grow aloe and cacti, lemons and limes, and flowers from the 4 continents. Her claim to fame was really sealed when, in 1687, she was the first Northern European to successfully grow a pineapple to maturity. And not surprisingly, this pineapple became part of her self-fashioning, which was really quite extensive and included several portraits, a portrait medal, and of course, her collection of watercolors. Notwithstanding the impediments that women faced in that period in participating in the creation of botanical knowledge, they did do so, particularly through illustration, but also, like Block, through self-study and by embedding themselves into networks. So Block in particular, she claimed her place as a, quote, the first cultivator of all the most exotic breeds and most studious investigator. And this was Paul Herman, who was the director of the Leiden Botanical Garden, who said that about her in 1698. And this was really to call her a cultivator and an investigator was to credit her in a way that women were typically not credited, even though women, going back to Marie de Blimeux, for example, had exchanged specimens with gardeners and botanical specialists like Clusius. So the network for Block, without access to the Royal Society, without access to the university, without Latin, access to networks that included individuals like Paul Herman was really critical. And it's not surprising that the most important information about Block's achievements come not from her, because although she left an exceptional collection of watercolors, she left no treatise and she left no diary. So we learn about her from often the male members of that community. And notwithstanding whatever obstacles she may have faced as a woman in gathering botanical knowledge or trying to travel to acquire specimens, Block was really unwavering in her pursuits of specimens to grow her garden, which she did by trading as opposed to traveling, and also the development of her skills, which she did by accumulating countless treatises, which, although she always maintained that she did not know Latin, most of them were written in Latin. So she left us no writings or documents to tell us about her sentiments on gender equality or confirming the presence of an emerging consciousness, but I argue that Block, in fact, did hold feminist sentiments, and that's based in part on her last will and testament, which conceived of Pfeifferhof and her vast collection of watercolor as one, which she intended to go to her goddaughter, as well as with respect to the choices she made when it came to patronage. Now, it's not surprising that Block referred to her collection of watercolors in her last will and testament, because it exceeded by far any similar collection that was in private hands. So here, the title page of the sole bound volume that remains intact from her collection, which is at the Rijksmuseum, shows here plusieurs espèces de fleurs painted d'après le naturel, so meaning afterlife. And if you put that against, for example, an example from Simon Scheinfurt's Kunstbuch, which is a Narcissus by Katharina Lindheimer, even though the book was begun at about the same time as Block was compiling hers, the quality and certainly the quantity of illustrations is cannot be compared. And the third illustration on the slide is by Jan Moninckx, but is of a nasturtium, and it comes from the Moninckx Atlas, which is that prestigious project that was commissioned by the regents of the Botanical Garden in Amsterdam. Now, that project spanned more than almost 3 decades, consists of 9 volumes that are bound, and the illustrations are made on parchment, and they were made by Jan Moninckx, Maria Herolt, and as well as Withoos. And they really set the standard for what quality botanical illustration could be. And in total, the illustrations number over 400. So in comparison, in terms of quality, and certainly many of Block's illustrations reach or exceed that standard, although it's true not all of them do. And then in terms of quantity, although most scholars thus far have referred to approximately 400 watercolors, that's only based on a partial inventory from a collector who purchased part of her collection. So my belief is that there's several hundreds more than the 400 that are believed to exist. Now, through that combination of artistic patronage and also the dissemination, because the sheets obviously circulated and Block would have shown them to her visitors, Block, and together with Merian and Herolt and Withoos and Moninckx, really redefined scientific illustration. The collection was assembled probably over a period of 30 years or so. And this is an image, for example, of the inventory to which I referred a little bit earlier, which belonged to the merchant Valerius Röver of Delft. The inventory, although it is not always precise, and we know that there's some errors in it because, for example, of the plant and the artist that Röver identified when he was compiling the inventory several years after Block's death, it is useful because we can catalog at least 17 artists whom are said to have worked for Block. And of these 17, 4 are the women that are the subject of the talk today. Now, for Merian, Herolt, Withoos, and Moninckx, becoming a successful sort of working for profit artist illustrating natural history was not as straightforward as one might have thought. Now, certainly there are women who painted in oil, and this wonderful portrait of Rachel Kraus is an example of that. But artistic training was largely, although not always, limited to what the women could learn at home. And Alida Withoos could not have been able to follow in the steps of her father and brothers who went to Germany and London and Italy in pursuit of inspiration and further artistic training. Moving away from home as a single woman to ply a trade, it was not unheard of, but it would have been challenging. And joining a painters guild, which was possible in some towns in the Dutch Republic, this was really on a case-by-case basis, it was not always obvious, it was expensive, and frequently required contacts. So the success of these women, if success is measured in commissions and output, really required extensive networking. And each of Merian, Herolt, Withoos, and Moninckx, who issued from artistic families, were provided, as you will, with an immediate kinship network that provided these most important connections, as we will explore a little bit later. But with the exception of Herolt, who was trained by her mother, Merian, all of these connections were overwhelmingly dependent on fathers and brothers and uncles, so they were mediated by men. And in that environment, women would have been constantly reminded in subtle and not so subtle ways that they were different. And for example, Joachim von Sandrart, a German who was the first art commentator to include Merian in the printed treatise, albeit as part of an entry devoted to her husband, complimented Merian, even compared her to Minerva. And he said she was a graceful painter of flowers. But he could not finish his entry without reassuring his reader that she was also capable of regular and good housekeeping. And Block did not fare much better. Botanical experts who referred to her in their scientific treatises, they called her Botanic Sibyl, a faithful wife and a person famous for her wisdom as well as her piety. And this was quite apart the fact that she was an exceptional horticulturist. Needless to say, whenever either Sandrart or people like Brain or Herman or others referred to men, there was no such qualification. And these sort of contextual, the way that there's a difference between men and women, I argue, is particularly important when we consider the female community that develops. So you can imagine that in that context, it provides sort of assembly on the basis of sex, if nothing else, already sort of an aura or something that is appealing. Now, there are no surviving contracts setting out the terms of the commissions, nor of the correspondence confirming how Block came to know the four women artists, or how she paid them, or what she asked them to do. Their respective kinship and social networks would almost certainly have provided them with their point of entry to Weverhof. And with respect to the money part, because these were women working for profit. They needed to earn a living, very much in the same way that Block was extremely wealthy and she had to pay to get what she wanted. So again, I referred earlier to the work of Finance, and he did the archival work on the Amsterdam Botanical Garden, and he found that when the artists were working on the Moninckx Atlas, that prestigious project, the artists each earned 4 guilders, adjusted slightly upwards over the years for each illustration. And it appears that Jan Moninckx, who was in charge of managing the project, was paid the same per illustration as the 3 women. And since the Moninckx Atlas was being illustrated at roughly the same time as Block's collection was being built up, it would be surprising if the women worked for much less when it came to Block as opposed to the city. Now, Alida Withoos is not a name that is commonplace unless one focuses on women artists of Northern Europe, because today the name of Maria Sibylla Merian is much better known. But it was indeed Alida Withoos who first began working for Agnes Block. As I mentioned earlier, she was issued of an artistic family, a very large family, and the father, Matthias Withoos, trained 5 of his 8 children to become artists. And that included Alida Withoos, who was really trained to produce beautiful oil on canvas, such as this Sottobosco here. But she could also execute wonderful watercolors on paper or on parchment. Now, she was known as a spinster daughter because she did not marry until the age of 40, and she remained at home caring for her father. So one can imagine that to earn a living as an artist, in addition to socioeconomic and cultural expectations, her options would have been even further limited by her domestic obligations. Now, her kinship network probably provided her with entry into the world of Agnes Block. First, Otto Masseus von Schrick, who was a close friend of her father, had worked for Block, and two of her older brothers also worked for Agnes Block. But, and one of them as early as 1682. But by 1685, it really was Alida's turn to begin working for Block. And as far as we can determine from surviving artworks, which an equation that is made more complicated because so many works are unsigned and so many are undated or only partially dated, she carried out most of the work for Block from the Withoos family. And she appears to have been one of Block's favorite artists, which is a theme that we will return to. And we have no idea how Maria Sibylla Merian came in contact with Agnes Block, although it's fair to imagine that it would either been through the garden circuit with which Merian quickly became accustomed once she moved to Amsterdam in 1691, or it could have also been because of her publications. Merian was German-born, and she left Germany in 1686, when she moved to a strict Protestant Labadist community in Friesland. And from there, she moved to Amsterdam in 1691. Now, Merian was married in Germany, but she left her husband for good, at least in 1686, and she never returned to Germany after she left for the Dutch Republic. She was officially divorced in 1694. So that made her a single mother in Amsterdam in 1691, in a world where the Amsterdam Botanical Garden was within reach, because she moved to the center of the city, and in a world where people like Agnes Block was looking for artists to publish to produce illustrations for her. The last of the artists to come within Block's ambit, as we're concerned this evening, is Maria Moninckx. Now, virtually nothing is known about Maria Moninckx, and the first drawing we know that she did for Block is from 1695. There may have been some before, but that is the only dated one. Now, in 1695, she would have been 22 years old, and she was by far the youngest of the artists that Agnes Block retained. And one of the reasons why we virtually know nothing about Maria Moninckx is the spelling of her last name, which is inconsistent in the archives. It was a very large family, and a disturbingly large number of men were named Peter or Jan, which means that it makes it that much more difficult to establish exactly her lineage. Some scholars have hypothesized that she was in fact the daughter of Jan Moninckx, whose name came to be associated with the Moninckx Atlas. So he was the managing artist for the project. I believe it is more likely that she would have been a niece or perhaps a cousin. But certainly she moved from The Hague and established herself in Amsterdam. And by the 1690s, that is where she was, and she was working for Agnes Block. So in all likelihood, she would have come into the patronage of Agnes Block through her uncle or cousin, Jan Moninckx, who had also done some work for Block before that, or else she may have been introduced by either Withoos or Herolt, who were already working for the Moninckx Atlas and may have just suggested that she come along with them and meet Agnes Block. Regardless of the way in which these women came to find themselves in the friendship or in the community of Agnes Block, it's clear that they would have been aware of the prejudice with which many people approach their work and their worth. And in the field of natural history, like every other field, but perhaps more so given the professionalization and institutionalization that I discussed earlier. And there's terrific quote by historian Derek Phillips, who noted, quote, "To varying extents, every female must have been aware that she suffered hardships as a result of arrangements between the sexes. In any case, feelings of discontent, dissatisfaction, resentment, bitterness, and anger about inequality and unfairness in relationship between the sexes were certainly not unknown among women in 17th century Amsterdam. They saw that being a man was much more the promising route to well-being." And this is something that I believe all historians and art historians know intuitively. There does not need to be a proof of that, but we do have some idea as to what at least Agnes Block and Maria Sibylla Merian wrote. And then to, again, quote Mary Garrard, "Feminism was a vital force long before it was given that name." So although she was sufficiently confident, for example, to communicate with botanical experts in Paris and in Bologna and everywhere in the Dutch Republic and probably in England, Agnes Block seemed to be aware that her status as a self-taught woman placed her at a significant disadvantage when it came to sharing knowledge and plant specimens. So, for example, early during her correspondence with Lidio Trionfetti in Bologna, which was effected through the intermediary of a nephew because she did not know Italian, she raised the issue directly. She wrote, quote, "The correspondence with a woman over botanical material can be said to be rare, and especially with a woman who has it for experience and without any study. So that I beg you to warn me if I make any error in denoting the names of plants." Now, Block's self-consciousness likely reflects the gendered epistolary conventions of her time. And after all, she was sufficiently assertive to reach out to these experts to begin with. But nevertheless, the very existence of the trope and Block's adherence to it suggests that the relationship between gender and botany had become increasingly difficult to navigate as the development of natural history and science moved from kitchens and private gardens to institutions inhabited by men. And Merian was arguably even more more direct and publicly sharing her frustration at the fact that the work of women artists was less valued than the work of men. In this poem, which was authored by Merian and her two daughters for the album Amicorum, the friendship album of the paper cutting artist Johanna Helena, contains the following line: "Dear friend, with that silhouette paper cutting, so innovatively employed and never enough praised, thou hast connected that thy skilled art with ours." In these verses, I argue, Merian and her daughters express a sense of community with Courtin, achieved not because all of them lived in Amsterdam or had a similar linguistic identity, but because they shared a common experience through art production. And this sense of community is the same that appears in Block's collection of watercolors. And now to the extent that I read that there is a gender implication or subtlety to be read in that poem, it is because, of course, paper cutting was an art that was practiced primarily by women. Women were often restricted to paper cutting or embroidery or the so-called technical or domestic arts. Now, in the case of Merian, there were certainly many men who also painted botanical watercolors on paper or on parchment, but she would have known, when she was in Nuremberg, that women in Nuremberg were not permitted to use oil paint, for example. So she was aware of also the simple lack of value that was even then given to works on paper compared to works on canvas or sculpture. So the artistic hierarchy was definitely alive at the time. We have no ego documents by Herolt or Withoos or Moninckx to tell us anything really about their attitude regarding gender. But we know that Herolt and her sister were raised mostly by her mother and with a strong sense of being Merians as opposed to Graf, which was the name of their father. And that's a point that was made very strongly, compellingly by Natalie Zeman Davis. And similarly, Withoos didn't marry until the death of her father. And one could regard her choice to focus on botanical watercolors rather than oil painting, which she was clearly capable of doing, as a practical choice given her domestic duties. But I suggest that beyond that, focusing on botanical watercolors gave her increased physical and creative freedom, which was an argument that was made by Patricia Simmons with respect to Fede Galizia. So by working from Weverhof, Alida Withoos was open to being inspired by the works of artists whom she may not have come across had she kept on painting canvases in the family workshop. So that choice to promote her career and this development of her skills is arguably a feminist choice. Now, it's arguable, again, that Block played favorites with some artists. And one example of that is that the pineapple that she so successfully raised from nothing but a cutting, when it was drawn, the work was given to Alida Withoos. At the time, there were other artists who also worked for Block who were closer to Weverhof, so would arguably have been more convenient to commission, but it was Alida Withoos to whom she asked to come. And coming to Weverhof would have been quite a journey. So traveling overland was possible, but mostly in the Dutch Republic, this was done by way of a horse-drawn boat. And although these were reliable and inexpensive, and there were frequent departures, these barges reached an average of about 7 kilometers per hour. So the Utrecht to Amsterdam route would have taken about 5 hours, a little longer for Alida Withoos. From that, I argue, and I think the only reasonable expectation is that the artists went and stayed for a period of time at Weverhof. And Alida went, and we know that she had several stays, and we know that because of the few drawings that have partial dates and partial signatures. Some of the drawings have a date or partial date, and then I rely on an attribution that I made. But between 1685 and 1691, during the months of May, June, July, and August, which are represented here by the illustrations of the Trésor du Duc de Berry, this is where she made the majority of her works. So this gives us a timeline to know that every summer, for a portion of the year, this is when Alida Withoos would stay. And these months happen to match fairly well the months much earlier that Herman Sachtleben, for example, was the only one who dated his work, would stay at Weverhof. So it is reasonable to expect that artists stayed there. And this here is a recreation of the estate that I made. And you can see, even though it is not particularly large, there was also land on this side of the road with a farmstead. There would have certainly been place to accommodate artists. And one could imagine that they might have even stayed with Block. After all, her situation was such that her stepchildren were gone. Her husband probably only lived part-time in the country. Otherwise, he was in Amsterdam tending to business. And it's reasonable to think that in these circumstances, Block would have enjoyed the company of other women who shared her interests in her gardens and in her specimens. Merian was divorced. Herolt was married, but working hard to help her mother with the workshop. Moninckx was childless, as was Withoos. So as a woman operating in what was primarily a man's world, and that is Block, operating in this men's work, she was aware of the usefulness of her self-fashioning and in crafting her legacy and to preserve her independence, it would have been natural for her to experience empathy and perhaps even a certain closeness with the women artists who visited her estate. After all, she would have had much more in common with them than she did with the other male artists or experts who visited, in the same way that the women artists would have had much more in common with each other and with Block than they would have with other female relatives or neighbors. And these marks of closeness can be seen, for example, in the way that Agnes Block, on the back of 3 drawings, unsigned, she wrote Maria Moninckx Fetchit. And this I take as a mark of closeness or perhaps even protectiveness towards the young artist for 2 reasons. The first one is that Block tended not to do that, to attribute the drawing to a particular artist unless there was a reason for her to do so. And the other reason is that these drawings are not the best that Block owned. Moninckx was young and she did not have the skill that Merian or Withoos, for example, had. Another mark of closeness would have been, for example, the addition of these butterflies some 16 years after the fact that Willem de Heer painted the Datura. So Block looked at her painting, at her illustration, and asked Merian to add these 2 butterflies. The butterflies have nothing to do with the Datura. This is not the painting of an ecosystem, and this is really more of an ornamentation. And if Block had not been particularly fond of Merian and of her art, she would have not asked her to do that. Because although it did happen, for example, that 2 artists, such as Withoos and Merian here, were asked to illustrate 2 different species of the same genus, although we're talking strictly in pre-Linnean terms here, this is not the same thing as adding a ornament. So in the midst of all of that, what makes a community? After all, the women came and went to Weiverhof over a period of roughly 15 years. And what I argue, based on the sort of bulk of the evidence, is that the women shared a sort of emerging feminist consciousness, certainly in their interest in art and in nature. And they came to form a community, whether this community was indirect in the sense that they could consult each other's work when they were at Weiverhof, or perhaps when they were sketching in the botanical garden, or that they in fact did meet. From this community, they could draw upon for understanding, for resources, for perhaps training and tips by looking at other people's work. Now, as noted by Stephanie Tarbin and Susan Broomhall, writing about community, I'm well aware, in early modernity, it sort of poses the risk of evoking a, quote, golden age of caring, consensual and participatory relationships and masking conflict or processes of exclusion. Now, of course, this risk is very alive here because women were being excluded increasingly from the formal institutions and formal processes of natural history. And as I said, they may not have meant, so this is not sort of this perfect golden age area of women coming together. But I argue it nevertheless provides us with insights as to how they may have worked. So just want to make sure here that we don't go too long because I do want to hear your questions. So how we can conceive of a community in this case is by, again, thinking to those 4 pillars. Membership. The women knew they were working for Block, that they were contributing to something that was larger than what they belonged to themselves. Similarly, we can see simply by the lines that I introduced at the very beginning that Esker, for example, And in the sheer quantity of illustrations, each of the women would have felt that they were contributing. They mattered to a project. They mattered because they would travel for 5 or more hours to reach Vijverhof to illustrate that pineapple or to illustrate that special specimen that bloomed. They had been requested. Certainly there was a fulfillment of needs as they were being brought into the broader garden circuit, but also this smaller, closer-knit community where they would earn money to sustain themselves and to continue to live somewhat independently, or at least to the extent that they could. Now, there's no particular evidence of a shared emotional connection, but I think it seems reasonable in the circumstances to speculate that they did experience that shared connection, being engaged in an important project together, being some of the very few women who were getting renowned and who were able to sign their work on occasion and to say, I am here, I am doing this, and I am doing this with other women who are doing the same thing that I am doing. And certainly in this world where this is here a detail. This is meant to be Agnes Block showing her works to other women. This is an engraving from the Royal Society, which was very exclusionary. I think that emotional connection would have been ever more present from being part of that group. So to return to Derek Phillips on his work on well-being in early modern Amsterdam said, quote, much of a woman's life was spent in a position of dependence on the man. Then says, this is not to say, however, that every woman did so. And it's true that each of Block, Merian, Herolt, Withoos, and Moninckx did, in one way or another, at one time or another, depend on the man because of marriage or artistic training. But they didn't submit to that authority, or at least not entirely, and each took an active role in pursuing her interests and in obtaining work and developing. That female community at Vijverhof would have provided them with practical benefits, financial reward, access to networks of patrons and collectors, the refinement of their artistic skills, but also intangible ones, such as the reassurance that came with knowing that they could count on other women as they forged a path in an increasingly specialized, overwhelming male environment. They were aware of the circumstances around them, but together they could become part of this community of discourse, to quote Erik Jorinck, and really shift the way in which scientific illustration was being produced. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for this wonderful and illuminating talk. We do have a couple of minutes for Q&A, and I can see already one question, and I have my own questions. Janice from the audience is writing, thanks for a beautifully crafted and persuasive presentation. There are no questions, but that was a comment, and I second that.
Thank you.
Of course. And so my question is that one of my questions is that how do you think the subject matter of most of these paintings that you showed with botanical illustrations or even other subject matters reveal the gender impacts or the gender implications of 17th century Dutch female communities?
That is such a good question. Certainly, today we think flower paintings and we think about women primarily. And it was even the case in the 17th century because commentators would write things such as, a woman's hand is so small and it's perfect to paint flowers because they don't require much by way of intellectual engagement. All you have to do is copy nature. But the reality is that men painted flowers, lots of men painted flowers, and they were enormously popular in the 17th century. There was a passion for nature and gardens. And so, yes, I think that in part reflects gender and the argument that women didn't have access, for example, to nude drawing classes and so on is certainly part of it. But I think also part of the answer is that these women needed to make money. They wanted to earn a living, and there was a very active market for these works. They were in demand. So I think it's partly gendered, but also partly explained by the market, and that focusing solely on the, oh, she's a woman, she does flowers. I think it really produces a narrow view, because looking back, there were many more contemporary artists that I compared in my database that were men that painted flowers than there were women doing so.
Right, yes. And it actually makes more sense when we're talking about 17th century Dutch paintings, Flanders, and thinking about the vanitas. That period and that idea, how do you think that impacted this kind of patronage, female patronage, and the artistic traditions that were developing at this time?
You know, again, there was a tendency for a while to look at these flower paintings and to interpret them as vanitas. So, for example, a wonderful Dutch artist, Maria van Oosterwijk, she was very much a flower painter, but she was deeply religious. Her father was a clergyman, and she painted vanitas. And there was something to be read and understood in her depiction, for example, of a fading iris. I think something completely different happens with the botanical works that we consider tonight, which is these are produced for their curiosity, for their scientific value, for they're beautiful, their works, their aesthetics, and there's certainly some bouquets, and there's often insects that are being introduced and a decaying plant. And I think there are definitely some Vanita symbols that carry through. But once again, the reading of it simply as, you know, I've read works from 30, 40 years ago that would take a bouquet and then take it apart, essentially finding a symbol with each flower. And I think that's really not the case, certainly not with the work of the women that Block commissioned.
Right. I do have a follow-up question, but there is a comment and also a question afterwards. Polly says, thank you for this passionate talk. It is lovely to show how they function in such a constrained world. Bravo, ladies. Thank you so much, Polly. And the next one is by Andrea. I very much appreciate the idea that women artists, patrons, etc., could form a community without having met. Could you speak more about that? Are there other communities like this that come to mind? I wonder if this idea could be applicable to other periods and locations as well.
Yes, I think that's such a fascinating point. And communities, you know, they're often shaped by national or religious identity. But I found Christopher Nygren wrote a wonderful book about Titian's icons. And one of the arguments that he made was that there was a particular image of the Ecce Homo that Titian painted that was then reproduced. Titian painted dozens of this particular image, and it was owned by a number of patrons around Italy and elsewhere. And his argument was that these patrons formed a community because they owned an image that joined them spiritually, even without knowing each other, knowing even that the other existed. There was something in the fact that they each owned a particular icon. And a similar argument has been made, for example, with respect to people who borrowed books from a certain member of clergy in England. And so they may not know each other, but the fact that they used the same person as an anchor to borrow books, to learn, to sort of, so the same kind of knowledge ends up circulating amongst these individuals. That has also been recognized as a community. And I think that that's why the sort of four pillars, the idea of not one of the pillars really implies that there has to be a meeting, in the sense that there has to be an emotional connection of some sort, but there's not physical connection doesn't come into play. And I hope that this is the kind of idea that can help us explore not just women community, but also other marginalized communities,
of course,
about which so little is known, that at least by taking that sort of higher collective view, that we can learn, gain some additional insights.
Right. We have 1 minute, and also a question that is several questions is in one question. So I'm going to read that to you, and I also encourage all of our audience to write your questions to me. I can send them to Professor POWELL-WARREN, or you
Please.
can also directly contact her, and I'm happy to facilitate that communication. But last question is, economically, what sustained the Verhof? I'm sorry if I'm butchering this word. The
No.
wars of the Dutch, Spanish, Anglo time impact the botanicals. Was the slave trade influence the estate? The pineapple was from the Caribbean.
Yes. So, so much there and all absolutely brilliant. So very quickly, 1672, the estate, the French invaded the province where the estate is, and it was reduced to rubble. She had to start over again. She was definitely getting a lot of her specimens due to Dutch trade, including the engagement of enslaved people. Merian worked later in Suriname with enslaved people and oppressed people. So that's definitely part of it. As a Mennonite, Block and her family did not directly engage with these activities because they were pacifists. But obviously, without the sort of colonial botany and the abuses that accompanied it, the estate would have not existed. And what maintained it? She was extraordinarily wealthy. She had her own money, and then after her first husband passed, she had more money, and that's how she kept it up.
Right. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate that you stayed with us for this full 1 hour. And I know you're teaching tomorrow morning, so I don't want to keep up. And our audience is thanking you for your comprehensive responses. I have also provided your email if there are any follow-up questions. So thank you so much again for being with us. And I would like to invite everyone here to our next week's talk titled Jewish Art Collectors Take Rembrandt to Their Hearts. So please join us again next Tuesday, same time, same link will work for every week. So please join us again next week. Thank you so much for being with us and hope to see you again in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.